Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn McDougall and I am one of the lead facilitators of the Tech We Want, which is a network of technologists, leaders, and visionaries who are collectively building infrastructure, tech products, and services that center human thriving and responsible innovation. Today we're here to co-create a shared narrative about the tech we want to see in the world. And the topic we're going to talk about with these incredible, brilliant, amazing panelists is all about what kind of cultural infrastructure and governance practices are necessary to build equitable movements, equitable tech, and equitable institutions. Cultural infrastructure, that's what we're talking about today. So before we get into it, what I'd love to do is have our fantastic, brilliant panelists introduce themselves and say a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and your relationship to the Tech We Want as a project. And then we'll get into some deeper conversations about cultural infrastructure and governance. Why don't we start over here with Coraline, and we'll move around the circle this way.
Sure thing. My name is Coraline Ada Emke. I'm the founder and executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source, which works at the intersection of tech ethics and open source. I've been a member of the Luminary community since the first cohort. Very excited about that, and I'm particularly interested in the topic we're talking about today in terms of cultural infrastructure because it very much relates to my work in codes of conduct in open source communities.
My name is Marco Rogers. I am a software engineer and leader. Been doing that for about 20 plus years. For the last 10 years or so, I've been working at venture-backed tech startups in various industries, from healthcare to social media and news media. And my connection to the project is through my lovely wife, Ania Williams, who's the lead on the project. And I like to feel like I have sort of seen her germinate these ideas early on, just from me sort of complaining about what I see in my industry, but I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Marco. Ania.
Hi, I'm Ania Williams. I'm a principal on the Responsible Technology team at Omidyar Network, and I'm also the lead for the Tech We Want. And I come into this work in many ways, particularly with cultural infrastructure. I'm always infinitely interested and fascinated by what helps people be together in healthy ways, and what frameworks, what tools, what resources can we create to help ensure that we are creating great, healthy environments for people to do work together.
Thanks, Ania. In fact, I feel like your introduction was sort of the first question I have on my page here is, what do we mean by cultural infrastructure? And I feel like maybe I'll come back to you because you were really starting to get into it there. It's like, what do we even understand that term to mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of it has to do with, actually, I have to kick it to Marco on this, because it was Marco that said this thing to me that stuck with me, which was that, like, it's not magic. It's like humans figuring out what they want to do with each other, like, every damn day. Which I think once I heard that, I couldn't unhear it. And I think really gets to the heart of what I'm talking about. Like, really all we're doing is, figuring out what role we're each going to play, who we're going to play it with, and how we're going to play it with each other. And I think a lot of that is built on trust and relationships, and what we come to learn about people after we spend some time with them and can predict, like, where they're coming from, what they're likely to do. But it's always also really important to make the invisible visible and to be explicit about how we want to be in relationship with each other, how we want to get things done together, and when those things go askew, when they inevitably will, and when conflict happens, which inevitably will happen, how do we navigate our way through it? What happens on the other side of it? What happens when we're in the middle of it?
Thanks, Ania. I want to come over to Coraline and Marco, because I know that both of you have deep experience working in open source. And I feel like ultimately our conversation today is going to be about what do we need in terms of building the right kinds of cultural infrastructure in the industry of tech, and also in the center of the movement around tech and justice. But I know for our project with the Tech We Want, we're borrowing heavily, not in small part because of your involvement, Coraline, from some of the principles in open source. So I'm wondering, as we're sort of setting the stage of what we understand to be cultural infrastructure, could the two of you sort of share a little bit with us about how you understand your experiences inside of open source and what that has taught you about cultural infrastructure? Maybe I'll start with Coraline and then we'll come to Marco.
Sure. I think one of the great tragedies of our time is that the word community has been co-opted. Unfortunately, if I buy a couch, I'm now part of the such and such couch community or whatever. But really, in the early days, especially of the internet, and I'm sure Marco will remember these times as well, it was very much about communities, and it was about the abolishing of distance that was keeping people separate who wanted or needed to be in community with each other. And I think kind of one of the breakthroughs or revelations almost 10 years ago was that, hey, open source, these are community-based projects as well. It's not just people coming in, fixing a bug and disappearing again. There can be really thriving communities of people who are gathered around a project that they really believe in. And when you bring people together, there are certain conditions that have to be met for the health and well-being of individual participants and the community as a whole. And that's where we get into governance, and that's where we get into codes of conduct and beyond. So I think that these digital communities, these early digital communities, have a lot to teach us about how humans take the best of themselves and the worst of themselves and bring them to those online digital community contexts.
Thanks so much, Coraline. Marco, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your own experience with open source and what you maybe have learned from being involved in that around the value or importance of community infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, community guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly enough, I said I've been working in venture-backed startups for the last 10 years. It was actually open source that was my sort of ramp into this industry. Before that, I worked at contracting shops, and it was sort of a regular job, like tech was a regular job, where you just got paid a salary. But I was so invested in trying to build things that I found my way to open source. And like Coraline was saying, is communities of people who were really invested in what they were building, and found a way to stick together so that we could continue working on this thing. And that wasn't a small thing, because there were tensions, there were issues. People had to get to know each other and decide that they wanted to sort of remain in this community. And I think from that, what happened was there was this offshoot of these new tech companies, and we are going to build things for lots of different people, and we want to hire people who care about what we're building. We want to hire people who have an opinion about what we're building. And it sort of was the precursor to this idea that the technologists themselves can have impact on what is built rather than just taking direction. And so I got recruited out of like these open source circles. There were people who worked at these tech companies, and they're like, we're hiring. So that was sort of my sort of segue into the tech community and the startup community. And it was really interesting to see how my job changed from just taking orders to what are we building and how do we do it together and who are we building it for? Those conversations were very new to me at that time. So
interesting. So your experience in open source brought you into a workplace context in which all of a sudden there was a higher level of collaboration that you were being invited into participating in.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wait, I want to chime in here too, because I feel like I remember also from these days that you would also like constantly be getting into fights with people about stuff. Like there was very strong opinions that were happening across the community as well.
I was wondering when we were going to get into the spicier side of it.
Oh yeah, no, this is where we're going. I want it so spicy, and I want it spicy all the time. Go.
Listen, when people are doing work for free, it's because they want their opinions and their their stances to be represented by what they're doing. Like they're only here because they care so much about this going a certain way. And I think that when you have that sort of environment, the people who are going to gravitate towards it are like personalities. You know what I mean? People who have strong opinions. And the underside of open source is also like people with very strong opinions trying to figure out how to work together. And just clashing constantly about it. So when my wife talks about fights, she's like not exaggerating. I'm talking about like real, like serious, clashes with people about technology, about how it's supposed to work, about who gets to work on it and who does not, and that spilling over into the social aspects of it, right? Like who are the kind of people who we want to be represented here? And I'm sure that we'll get into sort of the other parts of this, which is that what I've found, and I know Coraline has had this experience as well, is that these folks who just started out with like, I want to be involved in this project, they turn into tech leaders. They start companies or they go to companies, they build the technology that we're using today, and they end up being the people that influence the the societal and cultural sort of norms that we have today.
So I want to move on to what I think is my favorite question inside of this overall conversation, because I hope that it will get to some of the spice that you're talking about. And that is, I'd love to hear a story from each of you about what is a time where you felt personally tested, where you felt tested and had to lean on cultural infrastructure to move through those tensions, or not, as the case may be, right? So I'd love to hear if there's ways that you can share some specificity, some detail about some of these fights, about some of these experiences that you may have been in. And at the end of the day, it's just humans trying to figure out how to human with each other. But I mean, for the four of us, as people who are working in currently and have history working in and around people and communities who are trying to figure out how to work together, and it's not always working, I'd love for us to surface what some of those dynamics can look like. So I'm wondering if anybody has a spicy story that they'd like to kick us off with. Coraline, I hate to come to you, but I'm gonna, because before we stepped into the panel, I heard you say, I don't know about leaning on cultural infrastructure as much as blowing it up.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I want to hear that story.
Yeah. Like Marco, I've worked at a number of startups over the past decade or so. And because of the reputation that I built for myself with the work I've done on Contributor Covenant and other forms of equity and justice in the open source community.
Pause. Can you say a little bit more about what is Contributor Covenant?
So as a result of the work that I've done with Contributor Covenant, which was the first and still the most popular code of conduct for open source communities, I have a reputation as someone who's a leader in this field. And unfortunately, on several occasions, that's been exploited by employers. I was on one of the earliest community management or anti-harassment teams at a very large company that's very central to the open source world. It was great when they hired me. I had some concerns. Are they going to use my name to like ethics wash? There was a company that had a checkered history already. But I was convinced. I had myself convinced that it was going to be a situation where I would have leverage to really make a lot of change and a lot of impact on a lot of people. And I found that once I got there, that will to change and that will to center these things was not sincere. I ran into ableism. I ran into transphobia. I ran into lots of issues, and was eventually, because I continued to make noise, because I continued to hold the company and my peers to a higher standard, eventually I was forced out, and they tried to make me sign a hush clause. Where the community came in here is there was the hush clause was tied to my severance pay, and I really needed that severance pay. So people in the community that I knew from the social justice and tech world came together and put together a severance package for me, which allowed me to not sign the hush clause, which allowed me to go public with my story. I wish that there had been infrastructure within the company. I wish there had been the culture that they had actually kind of painted a picture of, but I did have that support from my community, and the advice I give people is to find your people, because you're going to need them.
Wow, that is a really powerful story on both sides, right? Of the sort of ethics washing that happens, where it's purported to be some kind of cultural infrastructure for tensions, and actually there isn't one. But then on the other side, having the more informal infrastructure in the communities that you've been part of people sort of showing up. Wow, that's really interesting. Ania, I'm wondering if you might be able to share some stories or a story about a time that you have been involved in some kind of personal tension, team tension, and you've had some kind of cultural infrastructure that you could lean on, or not, as the case may be.
Inside of Omidyar Network, overall, the culture there is one of the best that I have been in, when you have, such a diverse group of people that are trying to do stuff, and it's inside philanthropy, which institutions are different than startups. One of my favorite parts of this whole project is our infrastructure fund.
Yep.
And the infrastructure fund was something that the way it played out, it was quite controversial and sort of getting it done inside of Omidyar Network for just mostly reasons, the fact that there wasn't necessarily like a precedent for it in what we had done before. And, you know, the folks that also had to be approvers on this transaction, aside from myself, who obviously approved it, were people who were on our finance and our legal teams. And I had to get them to sort of understand a completely different frame of how to look at what we were trying to do. But it resulted in us getting into you know, some pretty heated conversations and conflicts and lots of hot emails exchanged back and forth with me and some of my colleagues. But, you know, and I remember it also kind of overlapped and came to a head at the moment that we were actually convening physically in person in Santa Fe. And it turned out that a couple of the people who were like in the mix of that conflict were also coming. And, you know, when they got there and we were all there, you and Jocelyn, you and Carla actually sat down with all of us, knowing that we were kind of in the heat of it, and like you helped facilitate a conversation where we could be able to air out both like what was going on emotionally and why the experience was so frustrating for me, and where they were kind of also having some frustrations. And you helped us like get to a place of understanding after that. Like by the end of Santa Fe, there were still more things we had to work out, but I think everybody was willing to at least show up at that point and like, okay, what is it that we need to do to get this done? And, you know, a lot of that I think is the testament to what we have built into this project, that we had these amazing facilitators who also come to sometimes jump in to mediate conflict, and we're like, okay, let's get into the meat of it.
So this is interesting because what I'm hearing you talk about is like you were inside, so you were, there was this conflict, there was this inability to kind of see one another's perspectives inside of trying to move forward this particular, you know, was around the Luminary Infrastructure Fund. But I will say that what it sounds like what was also an ingredient here, though, was that your colleagues, though they were not, you know, steeped inside of a culture that had a set of practices around how to deal with tensions and conflicts, they were open to being part of it.
They were.
So there was an openness to it.
And I think that there were things that I learned from that, just in terms of like really getting a stronger perspective on the fact that like we were operating from different mandates. Like they were doing what they felt were their jobs, and there was a set of instructions that they were being given to do their jobs, and there was a set of instructions I was being given to do my jobs, and those two things were in conflict with each other. And at the end of the day, it was that facilitation that you guys did that helped us like show up as like people to like kind of like supersede the friction of like where we felt like mandates and policies and process was, into like, okay, we are people trying to do something for other people. Like, what do we need to do to get this done?
So I'd love to come to you, Marco, now and hear about, is there a time that you can think of, whether it's when you've been working on open source projects or since you've been working in startups? I know Coraline was talking in our previous panel about the idea that a lot of startups have like the values painted on the wall on the way to the bathroom, you know? And because I think fundamentally values are a core part of, they're not the only ingredient of, but they're a core part of what we understand as this kind of cultural infrastructure. I'm wondering if you have any stories that you would like to share with us of a time where you were involved in something where there was ostensibly some set of cultural infrastructural practices in place, and whether they worked or didn't to sort of support you in a tension that you might have been experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been sort of thinking about this, trying to figure out, I have lots of stories. Which ones can I actually share? So, you know, I think the context for me coming through open source, I remember really, like I said, I've been doing this for like 20 years, and the landscape has changed a lot. I remember sort of being involved when people first started having a conversation about how there were no Black people. Right? Like, hey, you know, we are trying to consider ourselves a really progressive space, but like we don't have any people of color. Like they're not able to thrive in this community. What's interesting about sort of online spaces is that more often than not, the person that you're engaging with is choosing to be anonymous, you know, for whatever reason. And so what happened almost immediately is a bunch of people saying, oh, actually, no, I'm Black. You just didn't know, right? Right? And it's because, you know, those of us who sort of come into these communities the first thing we experience is understanding that we have to try to conform, right? It doesn't pay to like be unapologetically Black in these communities. And I sort of watched that conversation start to happen and watch those norms start to change. And I think today, I talk to people who come into tech who, they feel much more comfortable saying like, I want to be Black in this space, and I want everybody else to know that I'm Black, and I want that to matter, Whereas before that, my what I experienced is like that can't matter. Like we're not supposed to talk about it, right? So I wanted to sort of contextualize in terms of talking about these norms changing, and then fast forward to me, starting to experience some success and becoming a leader within these tech organizations. Okay, I now get to hire people. We get to talk openly about diversity, and so I get to hire a team that has Black people on it, and like more Black people sort of coming into these tech spaces. And this is just not a small thing. I don't know how people feel about it today, but my experience with tech from sort of 20 years ago to now is like being the only Black person, then like, oh wow, there's one more Black person, that's amazing, and to then like having sort of enough Black people that we can all sort of talk about our experiences. So, I'm inside of an organization, and I'm in a director position, and we have sort of formed employee resource groups around different affinities. And for the first time ever, there's like a Black employee resource group.
And can you give us a year here?
I want to say 2014, 15.
Okay.
So a while ago,
Okay.
right? And I would say that I've been sort of engaged with DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion, really close to the inception. Like, like I said, I was there when it was like, oh, we get to talk about this now, right? And so this has been sort of a longer journey for me. So I'm at an organization. We have this employee resource group, and then we sort of experience one of the things that happens quite often, which is, a Black employee exits the company, and they have some things to say about how they were treated. Okay, and what's different, I've experienced this a number of times. What's different is there are enough Black people still at the company that we get to talk about it. We get to share experience that says, yeah, I've seen that. Like, they're not making it up. There are enough of us to sort of corroborate that story. But more so, we also now have, we actually have sort of a primary channel for being able to engage with the leadership. So I've talked to people, talked to companies about how to utilize employee resource groups. And one of the things I feel really strongly about is that it has to sort of have that official liaison with leadership to say, we need this to be addressed, right? And it's very different from being, an individual inside of an organization and trying to get yourself heard, because you often are like isolated, and you feel like you're like gaslit, like they're gonna tell you, oh, like no one else is experiencing that. But when you are able to get people together to share their experience, you can have that sort of collective power to negotiate with leadership. And then I found myself in yet another unique position as being one of the, being the only Black person at a director or above level.
Right.
When this whole thing sort of starts to hit the fan. And so I have a lot of other people in leadership coming to me asking, like, what do we do? Right? And so
You must know.
Right.
You're our only hope.
Somehow I sort of have the answers in my back pocket, and I just haven't been sharing them.
Right. Yeah. Why aren't you telling us how to solve diversity, equity, and inclusion?
And what I experience it as is more as, it's sort of similar to what Coraline experienced, which is people sort of pushing you to be the face of something while they have no intention of doing the right thing. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's just, it's a really tough place to be. But I think coming back to the idea of cultural infrastructure, having a group, like having a critical mass of employees who can all sort of speak truth to power in this way so that it can't be dismissed, marginalized, ignored, is a really big change in these organizations, and you know, it doesn't always work, but it's definitely better than it was before.
Okay, so real talk though, when in that context, in that particular story, when that employee resource and other employee resource groups were formulated, was it like, did those who made the decision to enable them to be formulated, did they understand that that it would turn into this collective power, collective negotiation thing? Because I feel like maybe if they had understood what kind of power might emerge from putting these together, they might not have done it.
I mean, you're right. They didn't know what they were getting into. I think that what some of us who sort of have been part of these movements, what we have learned, what I have learned, is the extent to which people can pay lip service to a thing.
Yes.
Right? You think that you can recognize it, or you think that you will sort of be able to identify when people aren't really, they aren't serious, you know, but you can't. They will go very, very far before they start to disappoint you, you know, and you'll be in what you thought was trusted relationships with people, and they'll break down very quickly when it gets hard, right? You know, we talked about values, and I think, you know, the term sort of having company values has taken on a lot of baggage. You know, my experience with it has been much more practical, and it's much more concrete. Your values are what sort of help you understand how to maneuver when things get hard. Mm-hmm. If things aren't hard, like, it's fine.
It's meaningless.
Right? Like, you know, you don't need guidance. It's when things get hard that you need guidance, and that's when people sort of start to disappoint and realize that they weren't prepared for what they ran into. And so you have, you've created this culture where you've told your employees that they will be heard, that you'll address the things that they raise, and then you do something that they are very, very not okay with, and they say, you know, based on these structures that we've created, you must address this, right? Like, your Black employees are telling you that they're not being treated well, and you must have a, you know, within the company, you must have a public response. You need to tell everybody what happened and why it happened that way. Mm-hmm. Man, the level of like angst and gnashing of teeth at the leadership level, it was incredible. And I mean, it was new for me too. I sort of, you know, and keep in mind, these are my peers. I've worked with them for years, and we've talked about these issues. And then as soon as the rubber hit the road, like, it folded. Everything folded.
Everyone disappeared.
Right?
Yeah.
First it was like, hey, can you fix it? Right? And I'm like, no, like, I'm on their side, actually. I would also like to hear what happened. I would also like for it to be addressed. And then, you know, when they couldn't sort of have me wave a magic wand, you know, I sort of got to see firsthand how these things turn pretty ugly, you know,
quickly.
And I had to sort of figure out where I situated myself, and that it was super tough.
Yeah.
I don't work at that place anymore.
Noted. Coraline, go for it.
Yeah, I think what you said really resonated with me, Marco, about values being most useful when you're navigating a difficult situation. And I've said in the past that, like, if your values aren't influencing your behavior, those are lies you're telling yourself. They're not really what you believe. It is very difficult, especially if you're in a corporate situation, to kind of know those boundaries. There's that, you know, we're told to bring our whole selves to work, but not that much, right? And I've actually been in situations where we're communicating that it's a community of safety, whether it's a workplace or an open source community. And when people show up, it's not actually safe for them. And that signaling, even that well-intentioned signaling on the part of managers or community leaders saying, yes, we believe in DEI, that isn't necessarily what's happening inside the organization at all. And I think it's actually worse when we have this half-assed commitment to it, because it brings people in thinking they're going to be safer than they really are. I actually had a situation at my last job where I had a transphobic incident happen to me, and it blew me up. So I got on my team Slack, and I was like, hey, I experienced some transphobia today. It's really upsetting me. I'm going to take the rest of the day off, and maybe tomorrow too. And I actually had my manager say, don't use the word transphobic, because people might think it's not a safe place to work.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Wait, I wanna add something to
Please.
where we're at right now, because I think that there's also this really interesting dynamic, which I don't know if this is in fairness to corporate bigwigs or whatever, but I'm like, I'm thinking about, this balance that companies, especially the big ones, but like, yeah, I'm going to say especially the big ones, but that companies have to do to balance this idea of like values and how we want to create, a healthy environment and see people as whole people. And then the legal ramifications of like liabilities and things like that. And I think that, in my experience working largely in startups, like, or in, communities that are a bit more scrappy, I think that the idea is that you can actually lean quite a bit on these types of cultural infrastructures that you built in and try to like work through it, right? And that even in those kind of smaller organizations, though, this is why I'm like, I feel like the big corporations are like real fast to pull these things in, but even in some smaller instances, when you can't quite get there through that like community infrastructure, you like it escalates into a legal place,
Right.
and
So
then
all of a sudden
things,
it's a like societal infrastructure. It's like a governmental or a regulatory infrastructure that we
Exactly.
begin to lean on when we don't have when our community infrastructure can't hold up to the stress test of the tensions.
Yes, and like I think, in a smaller situation, especially because like in the USA, like we love suing people here. We will sue somebody. My coffee was too hot. Like I am suing. I think people get worried about lawsuits and whatever's. They call the lawyers in, and the lawyers are not like, let's sit down and have a facilitative repair conversation. They're going straight to the book of like, protect, 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 shut it down, gain control of the situation, which is all the dominant culture things rush in all at once. And it's like, do not talk to this person unless you are like explicitly advised in that we are reviewing the statement of every word that goes through it just to make sure that there's no liable thing that you're saying, you're not claiming responsibility for it. Like all of that stuff starts to happen. And I think that also adds a great tension when, people are trying to create an environment where we feel like we can try to work these things out. But soon as somebody kind of pulls the cord on like, a sniff of like, I'm going to do something that, might end the party for everybody, the lawyers come in and it starts to be like game over. You really got to fight to try to show up in a process with lawyers or mediation or arbitration as like whole people and humans. There's definitely no playbook for that.
Well, so this
or at
is
least
a great
not one I've seen.
You know what? I feel like, one of the things I wanted to add, so Ania's absolutely correct. Once lawyers get involved, things get exponentially more difficult because their goal is to say, you are about to start to navigate this legal system and it does not care about any of this stuff that you're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
And they have a different job.
In many ways, the legal system is like the like absolute epitome of dominant culture.
Absolutely.
It is the protector of dominant culture. Its raison d'etre is to maintain the status quo.
The only thing that I feel like I wanted to add on top of what Ania was saying, in my experience, I don't know if there's such a thing as a good lawyer, but the best lawyers, the counsel they give you is how to not get involved in legalities. Like you don't want to do this. Like what I'm advising you to is to like fix it at a human level so that you don't have to do this. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think what's important about that is, bringing these human elements, having this cultural infrastructure is really about being able to continue to move forward without it like really devolving into what can only be conflict. You know what I mean?
So this is what I'd love for us to talk about next is that I think, we've talked a little bit about values, which is that which guides us when things get hard. The other thing I'd like for us to sort of surface in this conversation is the other word in the title of this conversation, which is governance. And I think that for me, the term governance refers to like how, as either collectives or individuals, we sort of agree on how we're going to allow things to move forward. But also I think inside of the concept of governance is the concept of accountability, what we've been talking about. And it's exactly this kind of, these structures of accountability that we can devise and ideally can be alive in our communities that keep us from having to go to the lawyers, that keep us from having to like go nuclear and escalate into that like super dominant, super inhumane territory of the law. So I'd love for us to talk a little bit about, what are some essential agreements or tools that you've used, that we've used in the Tech We Want, that we're trying to build in the Tech We Want, that you've seen be successful in some of the other communities that you've been parts of, that allow us to be governed, that allow us to govern in ways that do have real accountability built in?
I would love to start that conversation, if I may.
I wish you would.
I've got a great example. I want to say it was 2016. I could have the year off in 1 year in either direction. But for the open source community built around the technology behind the Chrome web browser, which is Google's adware browser, there was a decision that was made by the team in charge of the project. So this is a project with literally tens of thousands of contributors, right? So there was a decision that was made by the leadership, which corresponded to the Google engineers, that user-defined style sheets would no longer be supported in the Chrome browser. And what a user-defined style sheet is it's mainly used by folks with disabilities to make sure that a font size that there's a minimum font size, that there's a minimum amount of contrast on screen. So it's used as an accessibility aid for a lot of folks because we're not building tech that's accessible. So when the Google team decided that they would drop support for user-defined style sheets, there were lots of folks in that community, in that open source community, who gave a damn and saw the negative impact, and they made a fuss about it. And they were told things like, well, it's only a small portion of our user base that needs it.
The gaslighting that we've heard
Gaslighting
before.
And centering the
I was going to say,
centering the
clearly
center.
not centering the margins.
Yeah. And it was a big fight within the community. And finally, the Google engineer said, "This is not a democracy. We know you're unhappy with it, but this is just the way things are going to be." And I think that when we see people behaving in that way, and there are tons of examples of that, what's happening is that there's an implicit social compact or social contract between the leadership of a project, the people who are doing the governance, and the people who are involved in the project. And you said something earlier about making the invisible visible.
Mm-hmm.
While these social contracts are in place, people trusted that the leadership would listen to them. People trusted that the leadership would do the right thing for the right reasons for the right people. And when that failed, we were all very upset, but there was no legal recourse for it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So a lot of the work that I'm doing, that we're doing here in OES now, the Organization for Ethical Source, is making that social contract also an explicit governance instrument, which does create that system of accountability that is necessary for legitimate governance. You have to have consent and you have to have accountability. So that is something that we are moving into as an open source, as a broader open source ecosystem, and it's going to be even a bigger fight, I think, than codes of conduct, because there's a whole another level of accountability and leadership that's required for governance of a large scale community, and we don't have a lot of prior art in the open source world for how that should work equitably.
So what I'm hearing you say is that what you're trying to do now, the work that's happening now, is to make visible what was implicit in that situation that you described, where the engineers ultimately were like, shut it down. There was implicit there. There was one expectation on the side of the participants, and then a completely other expectation on the side of those who actually held the power. And then when that became explicit, it was evident that those were not the same.
Yeah, and the people in power had no accountability to the body of volunteers. I'm sure many of whom left and the vacuum was immediately filled.
So I'm wondering, Ania, if you can talk a little bit about how we're thinking about that inside the Tech We Want, and also, if you can share a little bit about, because I know that in being involved with you in this project from the very sort of inception in many ways, although I'm sure you two were involved in thinking about it even before, I certainly came on the scene. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you what some of the choices were about how we moved into even the inception of the project, and certainly through the earlier periods of the project, to thinking through this question of shared power, and then how are we going to be accountable to one another as a necessary condition for appropriately and adequately sharing power inside of the project.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm like, so we're 2 years in and we are very close to, but still don't even officially yet have the sort of the documentation in place, which is being worked on by Coraline. And in fact, I was thrilled to have Coraline come in because I was aware of all the work that she was doing through OES, and before that like this was, I'm like, this is her juice. Like, we need some of this Coraline juice up in here. Because I'm like, if it works in the open source community, I'm pretty sure we could, like, it'll work here.
Right.
Because I don't know.
Because how many fights you
I don't
witnessed?
write code, but I'm like, just the stories that I have heard from like Marco and all of his friends that have been in open source, it sounds like the wild fucking West. So I'm just like, if it's keeping people like corralled over there, it'll probably work with this group of people. And so, like, in the absence of having those things officially in place and everybody having consented to them, you know, we are looking at trust. Like, we're depending on trust between individuals, and one of the things that I did, like, as the kind of first step, the first people that I asked to come into this project were you and Carla. And Carla Monteroso, who's the other lead facilitator in this project. You know, I specifically asked Carla because I knew that she had such a strong lens on power and like a very strong power analysis. And I'm like, okay, ON just said they're going to give me $8 million to do this thing. It is fundamentally about power sharing. And like, I don't want to fuck this up. And so I'm like, I called Carla up and I'm like, Carla, I need you to like be here to help me like look at this. I need your lens on it. I need you to check me if I am not showing up in the ways that I am saying that I'm supposed to be showing up. And so I think that, you know, as the person who kind of has like started and maybe still technically holds most of the power in this project for now, like, I think that it's just been really important that those checks and balances are there, and that like I am willing to be accountable to the group, and to, you know, in the beginning you guys, but like even as the luminaries have come in, that I am accountable to this group of people. And there have definitely been moments where like y'all have had to be like, Ania, we need to pull you aside for a second. And I'm like, yes, okay. Like, and hopefully I have listened and done things. But yeah, like, I think that me having like surrounding myself with people who like I have made a commitment to, and like they hold me to that commitment is essential.
So what we're talking about here is relationships and trust.
Yeah.
In the absence of the like clarity around that cultural infrastructure. Because as I've been working with Coraline on this, and you're right, Carla and I have been thinking about the cultural infrastructure of this community from the very beginning of our own involvement in this community. And the reality is, because we're attempting to share power, we're trying to co-create these pieces of the cultural infrastructure that we're going to collectively consent to being accountable to, and ways in which we're going to be consenting to being accountable to each other. And so in the absence of having completed that task of co-creating those documents, what we're leaning back on, what we're falling back on, is relationships and trust.
Yeah. And like another thing I want to add to is that, you know, we have had these really important moments where, like, there's a story I was telling you the other day that, you know, Carla had me try to work out what the values were of the tech we want very early on in the beginning, maybe around the very first convenings that we had. And we went through some stuff. You know, she did some exercises with me to pull these things out. And we had even held some sessions with the luminaries in the first couple months of, you know, trying to surface what values and where were their cross sections. And we did all these different types of facilitated exercises. And we had things that were out there and they were on the board, but it didn't really, nothing was really gelling. I mean, like, I feel like we could have certainly put something together, but I don't know that it just didn't, it wasn't, there was something that was not quite clicking. And it wasn't until, you know, Santa Fe, where, you know, we talk about Santa Fe a lot in terms of conflict, because I feel like even when I think about like the 3 in-person luminary convenings that we had, I feel like there's a classic arc of like, in the beginning, everyone comes together, we're just getting to know each other and it's warm and it's like, oh, look, we're here, this is going to be fun, let's go on a ride together. And then like the second one where we have been riding together for a little bit, the trust gets tested. And, you know, then we start to surface where there's differences here and we don't actually all agree on everything. And what are we going to do with that? And like, am I still rocking with you? I don't know, you know, like that tension and the conflict. And then I think, you know, by the time we came into Pasadena, the final luminary convening of that 1 year arc, I think people kind of came back together and they reconnected and they kind of were like, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, okay. And, you know, there's all these other like nuances inside of that. But it wasn't really until after that big, like the arc of the conflict, that when I got back from Santa Fe and then Carla and I sat down again, it started to just flow after that. Because it was like we actually knew what we needed because we had actually gone through a hard enough moment where you want to have something like this and you didn't quite have it yet, but you're like, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think it was the difference between having something that like, oh, this is the cute words that we put on the wall that you see on the way to the bathroom. Nah, this is like for real, for real. This is how we show up. And when we're not showing up like this, like we really, even in the values, we didn't just be like integrity and confidence and whatever, like words, descriptions of like what we feel like that means. It is synonyms of like, it is this, it is not that. We have like literally 2 poles of like, you could be somewhere between. When you're over here, you are not in the area of showing up in alignment with our values. There's even examples of like, it looks like this, it does not look like that. And a lot of our ability to actually articulate that came from conflict.
If I can
Yeah.
add on to that, I think at first I was feeling a little bad, like, oh, we didn't have these documents in place from the get-go. But I think we needed that journey to get us to a place where those would be more than words on
Yeah.
paper. And I think one of the unique things about the way this community has come together and the way the community has been built very intentionally is a different trust model than the dominant culture. The dominant culture is a very transactional trust model. You show up and you do the thing I expect you to do 5 times, and the 6th time I'm gonna trust that you're gonna show up and do the same thing. Whereas the trust model I think that we have within the Tech We Want community is more relational.
Yeah.
So it did take us time spent together online, spent together in person at our gatherings, getting to know each other, getting to hear one another's histories and lived experiences and aspirations. That we were able to coalesce as a community and be at a point where, yes, now we have the confidence that we need to write this down and to hold ourselves accountable to these things that were very much in flux and being tested, and sometimes messily. Right?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, so much of it messy.
Yeah. But we had that relational trust that we built over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's allowed us to get to where we are now.
Yeah.
And that's a value that I do want to see, and I'm confident we're going to carry with us as this organization continues to develop.
Yeah.
And I think that what you've named here is that in our situation, what we're trying to do is not only are we trying to have a system of governance that is that involves accountability, that allows us to be accountable to one another, but we're also trying to co-create that system. And it's only through time and building relationships that we're able to get to the point where we can effectively co-create something. It's only through going through the challenges, the bumps in the road, that allow us to be able to identify even what it is we need from one another. And I think that this is one of the real genius parts of designing this project that you've had from the beginning, Ania, which was, we have to be together. We have to gather. We have to be in physical and, in some cases, digital community with one another so that we give people an opportunity to build those relationships and to build that relational trust, because only through doing that are we going to be able to figure out what we need and what we can all legitimately agree to and expect from one another. And I think that this is where, you know, we're very fortunate to effectively be building this institution from the ground up, as opposed to being inside other institutions that are trying to change from within, where it can be much more difficult to enable you to have that space and time to build that deep relational trust. And like in the story that you told us, Marco, where you thought you had this trust with all these colleagues that you've been working with for a really long time, but in fact, it had never been tested. It hadn't been tested in quite those ways. And when the test came, it turned out that the trust and the infrastructure was not strong enough to withstand the tension or the conflict that was arising.
Yeah, correct, absolutely. So, so Ania mentioned this earlier. One of my favorite quotes, right? There's no magic. It's a very deep sort of thing for me. So I know we don't have enough time for me to go too far into it, but There's this idea that there's an institution, and the institution operates this way, and you don't have a lot of control. Like when I say there's no magic, it's really pushing back on that idea, right? Things work a certain way because human beings show up and make it work that way. And you can change it, right? Either by influencing those humans, replacing them with different humans, which is sometimes what we need to do. But, coming back to this idea of community, like community is sort of earned by people coming together and figuring out what we want to do together, right? And the values around the community, the real values around the community are going to be what we do. Like whatever is written down on paper, it's not going to help. When things get hard, it's not going to help, right? It might be a guide. You might go reference it to remind you what you said you were going to do, but then you have to show up and do the thing, even when it's really super hard, right? As you all were sort of talking, this idea that like, I think, Coraline, you were sort of saying it, right? You come into sort of a new organization and you want to see something written down. You want to see that somebody's thought about how we're going to organize, what our values are. And I think, that's it's an understandable and sort of natural thing to want. But what I've learned over and over again is it almost is not the right thing, because that community has to be earned. Those values have to be earned by saying like, these are the values because we went through it and we all agreed this is how we want it to be. Not because someone else, who I don't even know, decided, but if I want to be in this community, I want to have influence over how it sort of evolved. And, going all the way back to sort of what we learned about open source communities is sort of, that's what we experienced. I didn't really sort of recognize it at the time. But the culture that I experienced is because there were like one or a few people at the center who was like, I started this because I wanted it to be a certain way, period. And that's how it is. That's why it is this way, because that's what I want, right? And it breeds conflict because those people, sometimes it sort of goes to the bad side, but sometimes it's also the flip side of it, which is the conflict is you're trying to come in and bring negativity or things that I don't want. And I'm not going to allow you because this is my space, right? So when we talk about sort of being in community with each other, it sort of moves us away from that hierarchy of like a few people get to decide. So you have to mix it up. There's no way to come to a quick decision if you are actually trying to sort of serve a wider community of people. So you have to mix it up, and those values have to evolve over time. I just think there's no other way that I've seen it work and people to actually like, continue in the community. What happens when you're failing is people leave. You can tell when you're not doing it because people leave the community,
I think I just want to tap on this too, because like it's important that we also do name sort of like what the shadow side of these things are, especially when we're talking about like co-governed things where we are like really leaning deeply into democratic practices and trying to be fair and equitable, like which means that, one, things don't move fast because you are trying to align people and make sure that you are like actually doing the things that you said. The other part of it too is that, one of the challenges we are actually all contending with in the tech we want right now, we literally were talking about this earlier today, is like how we expand the community. Like we know that we want to bring more people into this container that we're building. We are also like a little bit anxious about, letting a fox into the hen house. And so we're like, how do we do that that's in alignment with our values? How do we also make sure that someone new coming into this community is going to really feel like they also have some influence here without, doing something that's going to really corrupt like the foundation of what this is built on. So I think that there are, trade-offs to those things. And I think that we are also even asking ourselves, like, if this culture is so important, the more people we put in it, the more it feels like it might get diluted. And like, how much is enough? Like, when does it become like, this is the amount of people that can fit in this structure with us staying in the sweet zone of like living in the values that we said. And anything more than that, it starts to get so like obscured or opaque that like we don't actually really know what's going on at all. And we can't really say all the things that we're saying. And so like, and figuring out how these like different things link together, like that is also one of the giant questions that we are like living in and working in and trying to kind of solve and learning more with each interaction and each person that joins the project.
I think this is a great place for us not to end this conversation, but to leave it open-ended, because in fact we are on this journey together, and we feel like we've figured out some pieces of it, but it's a never ending, as you said, Marco, it's never static. It has to be dynamic. It has to be a living organism, a living thing. Our sense of cultural infrastructure, people are going to come in, people are going to change it, people are going to evolve it, and everyone has to be in relationship with the values that we're trying to live by in order for them to really be alive in the community. So I want to thank all three of you for being part of this fantastic conversation today. There's so much more we could talk about. There's so many more places that we're going to go together. So I'm really looking forward to being part of this community with all of you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Jocelyn McDougall. I'm one of the lead facilitators with the Tech We Want. And if you'd like to hear more about the Tech We Want, please follow us on all our social channels and come back and listen to some of our other amazing conversations. It's been really wonderful to spend some time with you today. Thanks.